The 1920 census revealed that for the first time, a little over half of Americans lived in large cities. And so, of course, this gave rise to new urban culture, new consumer industries that brought people into the cities for jobs. And one of the symbols of this new urban explosion became the rise of the skyscraper. Steel frame construction coupled with electric powered elevators made the construction of skyscrapers possible. One of the best known examples, of course, was the Empire State Building that was begun in New York City in 1929 and finished in 1931. And you can see the obsession of Americans with skyscrapers, even in movies throughout the 1920s, such as King Kong. If you recall in the movie King Kong, of course, the giant gorilla takes Fay Ray up to the top of the Empire State Building, up to the top of the Empire State Building. So you can see this obsession with urbanization, with skyscrapers, well into the 1930s as well. The 1920s also saw urbanization saw important changes to the American family. The American family became smaller. Better methods of birth control allowed families to limit the number of children that they had. And traditional American families began to break down under the stress of urban life. Increasingly, women had to seek jobs outside of the home um, in order to support the family. And this is really a continuation of Gilded Age economics. After women gained the right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920, it robbed first wave feminism of a great deal of its unity. And yes, even though you had organizations like the Women's Joint Consultation Committee in Congress, women saw little change to their status during the 1920s. One of the changes did come, however, in the Shepherd-Towner Act of 1921, in which the federal government first provided welfare payments to the states to try to bring down the numbers of infant mortality, to try to protect women. And so the Shepherd-Towner Act is an important example of the growing influence of women in politics, even after the passage of the 19th Amendment. And you can see a woman here dancing a new dance called Charleston. And I'm going to talk about how feminism began to change. You had a decline of first wave feminism and a rise of second wave feminism in many ways. With newfound political power, women grew more assertive, especially with working outside the home more, with better birth control methods, and upper class women who chose to assert themselves in public, who chose to challenge traditional gender norms, were known as flappers. Talk more about them in a moment. And because of women's increased role in politics, you had more liberal divorce laws that led to a higher divorce rate. The divorce rate more than doubled in the 1920s. But these women, flappers, they delighted in wearing makeup in public, in shocking their elders, smoking in public, drinking in public. These are all things that women had never done before, really, not at least quote unquote respectable women. And so you really see a new culture for women in the 1920s, at least those of upper class who could afford such things. The 1920s saw really the first youth movement in American history, especially among the upper class. As the family became smaller, better methods of birth control, adolescence became a distinct phase of life as opposed to going from childhood to working in the factory. uh, Young people used automobiles to drive away from their parents and do what it is that young people do in automobiles. And with the growing assertiveness of women and more free time, high school education soared, college education soared, women became more sexually assertive. And so all of these were changes in the 1920s as well, at least in the urban culture and especially in the upper class. Now, of course, the 1920s were known as the Roaring Twenties, largely because of Prohibition, because of the regular breaking of Prohibition laws. It was actually the largest category of crimes committed in the 1920s were the breaking of Prohibition laws. Prohibition gave rise to organized crime, and you had underworld czars like Al Capone there, you see, walking down the courthouse steps after one of his many acquittals in a criminal trial. And of course, Al Capone was eventually convicted on tax evasion. The newly created Internal Revenue Service to enforce the collection of the income tax, that's how they eventually brought down Al Capone, tax evasion. And of course, Capone eventually died from untreated syphilis. With more leisure time, sports became a mania in the 1920s. Organized sports, baseball rapidly gained descendants as the American pastime. Millions of fans attended games in 1927, the year that Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs, setting the home run record for a great long while. Colleges also began to play more college football. College football stadiums became larger. Down below, you can see the original design for Memorial Stadium at the University of Texas. That stadium, of course, was completed in 1924, and of course, football has been played there ever since. Sex became a more popular topic in the 1920s. At least people talked about it more openly. Plays and novels focused on adultery. Popular songs became more sexually explicit. And Hollywood exploited this obsession with sex by providing some of the first sex symbols in American culture. For women, Clara Bow and Theda Bara became sex symbols. In men, it was Rudolph Valentino, who died very suddenly in 1927. But Valentino, Bow, Bara, they were all sex symbols of films in the 1920s. You can see here on the left Clara Bow, the first it girl in Hollywood, and on the right Rudolph Valentino, the Italian immigrant who became a huge sex symbol among women in the 1920s. The 1920s also saw a huge expansion of visible African American culture. You had a centering of African American culture in Harlem, in New York City, and what was known as the Harlem Renaissance. W.E.B. Du Bois, the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard, you can see him there on the right, edited The Crisis, which was the magazine of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And the concentration of scholars, writers, singers, playwrights, poets in Harlem touched off an era of African American culture that was known as the Harlem Renaissance. The Urban League relocated to Harlem, and in 1923 began publishing the magazine Opportunity, which was the first scholarly magazine devoted to the study of African American issues. It shouldn't come as a total surprise that many Americans found all of these changes to society in the 1920s rather frightening. And so you have a backlash against them, which I call the Rural Counterattack. And it began with the Red Scare of 1919. When the Soviets took over Russia, when the Russian Revolution, rise of Marxism in 1917, that led to a fear of many Americans, especially among immigrants. Americans were afraid that immigrants carried with them the seeds of Bolshevism and anarchism. In 1919, the mayor of Seattle received a small brown package containing a bomb, and several prominent citizens also received bombs that were sent by anarchists in New York City in 1919. The Red Scare of 1919 began in earnest on June 2nd of that year when the Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer, had the porch to his home blown up by an anarchist who also blew himself up with his homemade bomb. And this started a series of raids organized by Palmer on what he called, quote, the alien threat. They rounded up almost 300 suspected anarchists and communists and put them aboard the Buford, which they dubbed the Soviet Ark, and sailed them to Russia. Of course, Emma Goldman was among the people that they deported, and one of the chief lieutenants of Attorney General Palmer in carrying out these raids was, of course, J. Edgar Hoover. This is how J. Edgar Hoover, the man who would create the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the 1920s, got his start. Another manifestation of the nativism and hatred, fear of immigrants and anything different in the 1920s was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the modern Klan. The modern Klan was organized by Colonel William Simmons on Stone Mountain, Georgia on Thanksgiving night 1915. They called themselves the Invisible Empire. They recruited by appealing to white supremacy, by appealing to nativism, by appealing to businessmen in towns and cities throughout the country. And of course, they considered themselves a civic organization to return law and order to the United States. They adopted slogans like America First, and of course they used vigilantism to carry out their attacks against anyone that they perceived as disrupting the social order. Victims of their vigilantism included not only African Americans this time, but also doctors that were accused of performing abortions, prostitutes, anyone who was alleged to have done something against the moral code of the time and place where the Klan operated. The Klan entered politics in the 1920s, and they elected majorities in the legislatures of Texas, Oklahoma, Oregon, and Indiana. The Klan, of course, could claim Texas as their banner state. By the middle of the 1920s, the imperial wizard of the nationwide Klan was Hiram Evans, a dentist from Dallas. And the Klan also achieved a stunning victory in 1922 when they actually elected an open Klansman, Earl Mayfield, as a U.S. Senator. Mayfield is the only open Klansman ever elected to the U.S. Senate, and he served one term in the U.S. Senate from Texas. The Klan also achieved perhaps its most notable goal in 1924 with the National Origins Act of 1924, signed into law by President Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge signed the law, he said, to keep America American. And the National Origins Act of 1924, of course, put extraordinarily racist quotas on immigration to the United States. And the National Origins Act of 1924 would stand as the law of the land on immigration until the Immigration Reform Act of 1965. Once again, the Klan saw themselves as a family affair. There was a women's order, and actually the largest parade of Klan's women ever carried off was carried off through the middle of downtown Fort Worth in 1923. 15,000 robed, hooded Klanswomen paraded through the streets of Fort Worth, Texas. There was a junior order for boys and a tri-K club for girls. They celebrated their whiteness, they celebrated Protestantism, and they opposed anything that was not white and Protestant. But many Americans began to see the Klan as offensive, even white Americans, not because of the racism, but because of the vigilantism. They claimed to be an organization that loved law and order, and yet they attacked those that they considered to have broken the social order in extra legal ways. So it seemed a contradiction to many Americans. After 1925, membership in the Klan declined sharply. And by the end of the decade, the Klan had once again largely gone underground and would not really reappear again in a large way until the post-World War II civil rights movement. The Klan would come back in a major way in the 1950s and 1960s. Despite the fact that the Ku Klux Klan may not be as visible today as they once were, they still very much are a presence in American life, unfortunately. They are the oldest organized terrorist organization in the United States, and here they are burning a cross in one of their secret ceremonies. This photograph was taken in 2003. Another way that Americans manifested their anxiety against change was in the way they opposed science. Tennessee passed a law barring the teaching of Darwin's theory of evolution because they said that Darwin contradicted the book of Genesis. And so, in the little town of Dayton, Tennessee, in 1925, state officials accused a biology teacher there, John Scopes, of teaching Darwinism. He did not, in fact, teach Darwinism. He merely mentioned Darwin in passing, but they used this as a pretext. Now, Dayton, Tennessee was in dire need of money. They were in need of notoriety, and so they made this into one of the biggest show trials of the 1920s. And they put John Scopes on trial for teaching Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. It became known as the Scopes monkey trial. The prosecution against John Scopes brought in William Jennings Bryan, the erstwhile presidential candidate, Secretary of State, who at this time, late in his life, was on a crusade in defense of the Bible and a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis. Meanwhile, the American Civil Liberties Union brought in Clarence Darrow, famous trial attorney, to defend John Scopes. And the cross-examination that Darrow made of Bryan on the stand is one of the classic court cross-examinations of all time. At one point, Bryan stated, "I do not think about the things that I do not think about," which I think fairly well sums up fundamentalism. And at another point, Bryan said, quote, "It is better to trust in the Rock of Ages than in the Age of Rocks." So, even though Darrow succeeded in making Bryan look ridiculous on the stand, the jury still convicted John Scopes of teaching evolution. You can see here Bryan and Darrow there sitting together during the trial. William Jennings Bryan was exhausted by his efforts in the trial and died just a few days after the conviction of after Scopes' conviction. But the Scopes monkey trial is a good foreshadowing of the culture wars between traditionalists and modernists that go on in the United States to this very day. In terms of politics in the 1920s, Warren Harding, the Republican nominee for president, won the election of 1920, promising a return to normalcy. His speechwriter had actually written the word normality, but Harding said normalcy during his inaugural address, and so normalcy has been added to the English dictionary. The Harding administration was more or less a series of scandals. Warren Harding himself had issues with extramarital affairs and fathering at least one child outside of marriage, and scandals involving Harding's cabinet members, including his Attorney General Harry Dougherty and Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall, really made the Harding administration the most corrupt presidential administration in U.S. history until the Trump administration. Although Harding's Attorney General Harry Dougherty often took bribes from bootleggers in order to exempt them from prosecution, it was actually the Teapot Dome scandal that came to epitomize the Harding administration. The Teapot Dome scandal surrounded the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, who accepted $400,000 in bribes in exchange for locating naval oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California. Congressional investigation revealed these misdeeds, and you can see here how the Teapot Dome scandal is bulldozing everyone in its path down the White House highway. In the summer of 1923, President Harding was on a tour of the West. He had given a speech at the University of Washington on July 27, 1923. That evening, he complained to his physician of pain in his upper abdomen. Turns out he had pneumonia. He retired to a hotel in San Francisco to convalesce, and there on August 2nd, 1923, President Warren Harding died of an apparent heart attack. Although there has long been suspicion in some circles that Mrs. Harding, Florence Harding, may have been involved in her husband's death, there certainly is no proof of any of that. The family will not allow the president's body to be exhumed and tested for poisons, but considering the way that Warren Harding treated his wife in terms of his extramarital affairs, and considering the fact that directly after his death she rushed back to Washington, D.C. and burned most of his papers, it certainly leaves open the question as to whether or not Florence Harding was involved in her husband's death. But in any event, Warren Harding died, and Vice President Calvin Coolidge became president. Coolidge was deeply depressed during his time in the White House. He slept most of the time. He was known as Silent Cal because he hardly ever spoke more than two words. One time at a dinner party, one of the guests said that her husband had bet her she couldn't get Coolidge to say more than two words, and Coolidge's response was, "You lose." Coolidge, however, was perceived as returning integrity to the White House, despite his deep racism and nativism. In the presidential election of 1924, Coolidge won the presidency, running for re-election, and Coolidge won the presidency running against the progressive candidate, Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, as well as the Democrat. In the 1928 presidential election, of course, Calvin Coolidge stepped aside. Republicans nominated conservative businessman Herbert Hoover, one of the first members of the graduating class of Stanford University. The Democrats nominated a New Yorker, Al Smith, a Catholic Owette, the son of an immigrant. And Hoover won in a landslide, but because the Democrats had run Al Smith, who was a Catholic and Owette, the solidly Democratic South showed the first cracks since, in terms of being a solid political bloc, since the Civil War. Hoover actually won Texas, Florida, a number of other former states of the Confederacy. And this signaled a seismic shift in American politics because for the first time, the Democrats won a majority of voters in the nation's 12 largest cities. And this would foreshadow the modern Democratic coalition that consists of people who live in cities, women, minorities. So this would foreshadow that shift in electoral politics. The next slide, of course, you can see Herbert Hoover on the left and Al Smith on the right.